In your daily routine, do you receive a file or report or possibly data in an email that someone wants you to query on a DB2 table or tables? This would happen to me quite a bit. And what I had to do then is I had to oftentimes write a program to be able to read the file, or I would have to pull the values off the report and type them into a query, and I'd naturally transpose them or type them in incorrectly. So to get around that problem, what I did is I created this command called Q. And what Q is it's an SQL with some extensions added, which allows the query to use information from the report or file and run the query with that data by pulling it out without me having to type it in. This video explains how the command works. I have other videos which is going to show some of the useful applications for the Q command, and I hope you'll review those as well. So let's take a look at this first query. First, I want to point out that this query resides in a PDS called q.pds underneath my user ID. In order to use the Q command, it expects you to have a q.pds partition data set up. That's how the Q command knows where to pull the query from. Now, as we look at the query below, you'll notice a lot of these strange extensions in here, surrounded by brackets. What the Q command does is it interprets these brackets and substitutes the values from the file or the report and substitutes them in the query prior to running it. Let's talk a little bit about what each of these extensions mean. The first character or first attribute in this extension identifies the relative line number in relation to where the cursor resides. So for example, if I put my cursor up on this line, that's relative line number 1. The line after it, which has Venn.I on it, is line number 2. The next line with CTN receive Q is line number 3. So if I was pulling data from this data set, then I would have to use this relative line number. I find that oftentimes 1 is the only number that ever gets used there. The next number, 1, identifies the starting position on the line that the cursor is on. So in position 1, for a length of 5, and N stands for numeric, so it basically says take that value just as it is and substitute it inside the query. Notice that we also have a possibility of a C extension, which says this is a character value. This basically says put quotes around the value once you get it. So it's going to be comparing either character value, possibly a date, possibly a time, possibly a timestamp. All need quotes around them when they're being run within a query. Notice these are all in the where clause. I can also have an extension in my result set. So what I'm saying here is whatever line in the data my cursor is on, take position 61 for 10 characters and call it vendor number. Okay, so that's basically what this query is doing. Let's take a look at how this query gets built within a data set. Here's a receipt data set which has a list of records that is receipt information. So if I wanted to see what that query will look like when I run it with the Q command, what I would do is I would type in the command Q RCPT for my query name, and I'm going to say show. And what this does, it says you don't execute the query, but just show me what the query is going to look like when I build it. Now look at, I'm down on line number 7. Press enter, and it generates the contents of that query, substituting the values on this line. So note, it took the 1909278 and substituted over here for the vendor number. So it's not going to take it from the database, it's taking it directly from the data line. It also substitutes the different values from the line, the one from the location. It's taking the 27317 from the receipt number. It's taking the sequence I from the sequence number. It's taking the receipt type C, which is an S that came from over here. Remember, that's the one we asked to put quotes around. and it's taking the company number. And that's how the query that will run if I put my cursor on this line and say to run that query. In order to get rid of these display lines, I type the reset command. And that just gets rid of them. Let's take a look at the query again, and let's remove the show and see what happens when we run that query against line number 7. Pressing enter, and note what it did was return a vendor number, the vendor document number, the containers received, date received, time received, retail cost. It retrieved everything I asked it to from this query and just substituted the values. This query works somewhat in the same way that QMF and Spoofy does, is that if there are certain things that you don't want, you can comment out the values. For example, you use double dashes in QMF and Spoofy to comment out the values. We're not going to return the date and time this time. Save that query. We'll use the reset command to get rid of the old values or all the data that was returned, the old result, and we'll run this again against line number 7 again. Note that it shouldn't have the date and time there. So you can see how flexible it is in returning the data you want to return. I don't have to worry about transposing the information. I don't have to worry about mistyping it because it's as it is on the source of data. We also have some other extensions we can use that are part of the Q command. Let's bring up another query just called vendor. A very simple query. What it has is just selecting the vendor number and vendor name, but what it's doing is it has an @ sign in brackets. All that is saying is substitute in the bracket, for the brackets, the value where the cursor is at, the word the cursor is on. So if we take the vendor query and come over here and type in qvend, we can come over, put the cursor on the vendor name or vendor number, and it's going to substitute that vendor number in the query, and we'll run it and return that vendor number and the vendor name. Now this can be very flexible because it does not care what columns that vendor number is in. If I had the vendor number sitting in column 2, that query could run exactly the same way, no matter where a vendor number was sitting. This gives a demonstration a little bit of what the Q command can do for you. Take a look at the other videos and see some other types of applications which can use the Q command in your daily job.